All right, kicking off another deep dive with ya. Today, we're going back to the 90s, to the Bosnian War. Might seem like ancient history to some folks, but this one, it's got echoes, even today. And the stuff you dug up, wow, the historical context, the cultural impact, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating, I think. For me, what always gets me about the Bosnian War is it wasn't just about, who gets what land or some political game.
Right.
It was about these deep ethnic tensions that had been brewing for, generations.
Like an eruption waiting to happen, right?
Exactly.
I mean, the sources paint Europe in the early 90s as this super volatile place.
Oh, yeah.
Berlin Wall just came down.
Yeah.
Everything's kind of up in the air.
Total upheaval. And then the collapse of Yugoslavia on top of that.
Right.
This whole federation of different ethnic groups, it was like throwing gasoline on a fire.
Oh, yeah.
Think about it. Decades, this whole thing's held together under, a pretty strict communist regime.
Oh, right.
That crumbles and boom.
Yeah.
All these suppressed national identities, all these historical grievances, they all come rushing back. Slovenia, Croatia, they're the first ones out the door in 91.
Right.
And that basically sends the signal that, hey, independence, it's a real possibility.
So everyone's trying to figure out who they are now, where they belong, who they don't belong with. We're focusing on Bosnia and Herzegovina, though, right? What made that situation so unique?
Bosnia was a melting pot.
Okay.
You had Bosniaks, Serbs, Croats, all living together, no clear majority. And for years, this diversity, it was kind of kept in check by the Yugoslav government.
Okay.
But once that control's gone, the idea of sharing power in a newly independent Bosnia, that terrified some groups.
Really?
Especially the Bosnian Serbs. They had strong ties to Serbia itself.
So it's not just about independence, it's about who gets to call the shots, right?
I got it.
The sources say when Bosnia declared independence in 92, that was it. That was the trigger. Bosnian Serbs just rejected it. And then, things get really, really bad.
Yeah. Ethnic cleansing is a term that we really see emerging from the Bosnian War.
Right.
A systematic campaign of violence, forced displacement, all aimed at creating these ethnically homogenous territories. Imagine being targeted just because of who you are, your family, your religion. It's horrifying.
Horrifying. And our sources bring up Srebrenica in 95 as this truly chilling example. Over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys systematically murdered. That really shook the world, It forced people to pay attention to what was happening in Bosnia.
Srebrenica, you can't overstate its impact. This wasn't just a battle.
Right.
It was calculated. It was genocide. It cut through all the fog of war and made people see the human cost of this conflict.
And it wasn't just the news reports either. Our sources talk about the cultural impact of the war, especially through film, like No Man's Land in 2001. It used this really dark humor to show how absurd, how tragic the whole situation was.
No Man's Land it's a great example of how art can humanize a conflict, I think. Even in war, there's still humanity, humor, that longing for connection.
Speaking of connection, one of the sources mentions a teenager who lived through the war. They said all those ads for humanitarian aid, they actually opened their eyes to the bigger picture.
Wow.
It made them realize the world was bigger than their backyard, sparked a lifelong interest in human rights. Do you remember anything like that from when you were younger? Something that made you suddenly aware of what was going on outside your bubble?
It's funny you should ask that. I grew up during the Cold War, and I remember seeing the Berlin Wall come down on the news.
Wow.
It was like this real tangible symbol of change, of hope, and it definitely stuck with me. I think those kinds of events, good or bad, they can really shape you, especially when you're young.
It is fascinating how those events, those seemingly random things, can shape how we see the world. But the Bosnian War, this wasn't just some event on TV. It had real consequences, for international relations especially.
Oh, absolutely. The atrocities in Bosnia, especially Srebrenica, put immense pressure on the United States, on the whole international community to step in. It was like this feeling of never again. It had to actually mean something this time.
So the world couldn't just stand by and watch.
Exactly. By the mid-90s, you've got NATO forces on the ground in Bosnia. It was a huge shift in policy, a real turning point in how the world responded to ethnic conflicts, to genocide.
It showed how these conflicts could affect everyone globally. It's not just a regional problem when something like ethnic cleansing is happening. But, besides all the heavy stuff, the sources also dug up some some interesting, even fun facts about the war.
Oh, yeah, those little quirks of history. What caught your eye?
Well, first off, did you know that the term ethnic cleansing, it actually came from the Bosnian War?
Hmm.
It wasn't something people really used before that. It's kind of chilling how a conflict can change the way we talk about the world.
It is a sobering thought.
Yeah.
And speaking of phrases, Bosnia and Herzegovina, they call it the land of 1,000 rivers sometimes.
Right.
Beautiful, but until you realize it's not just about the scenery.
Right.
It also reflects this long history of conflict.
It's like those rivers, they become these symbolic borders.
Yeah.
Dividing lines people are willing to fight and die over. Powerful image.
Yeah, very powerful. And then there's the fact that No Man's Land, it didn't just raise awareness, it actually won an Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film in 2002.
Wow. So the world wasn't just watching, they were recognizing the power of the story being told. That must have had a huge impact on how people saw the conflict.
It definitely contributed to a wider understanding of the war, for sure. And it highlighted how important film is, as a way to make people feel empathy, to start conversations about tough topics.
Yeah.
But speaking of impact, we can't forget about the legal side of things.
Yeah, the legal ramifications.
Mm-hmm.
The Bosnian War really had a profound impact on international law. All the atrocities, especially Srebrenica, they led to the creation of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia.
Right.
The ICTY. The ICTY, yeah. Our sources mentioned that. Can you remind me what that was all about again?
Sure. The ICTY, it was a special court set up by the UN to prosecute individuals responsible for war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, all that, committed during the Yugoslav wars.
Okay.
Including Bosnia, of course. It was a landmark event, really. For the first time since the Nuremberg trials after World War II, you had a dedicated international court to hold people accountable for these horrific acts.
So it wasn't just about stopping the war, it was about getting justice for the victims.
Absolutely. The ICTY, it served as a kind of a powerful deterrent. It sent a message. Commit atrocities and you will be held responsible no matter who you are.
That's incredible. But this deep dive, it's not just about rehashing history.
Right.
It's about understanding how something like this could even happen and most importantly, what we can learn so it doesn't happen again. Looking back, what were some of those warning signs, those seeds of conflict that were planted before the fighting even started?
Well, like we talked about before, the ethnic divisions in Bosnia, that was huge. But these divisions, they weren't just about cultural differences.
Right.
They were tied up with political power struggles, too. The rise of nationalism across Europe in the 80s, especially after Tito, Yugoslavia's leader for years after he died, that played a big role.
Tito's death, that seems like it was a real turning point. He was a strong man. He managed to keep a lid on those ethnic tensions, at least outwardly. It's a bit like that saying, when the cat's away, the mice will play, isn't it?
That's a perfect analogy. Tito's gone. And that delicate balance of power in Yugoslavia, it just crumbles. And these nationalist feelings that had been simmering, boom, they explode. And then the Berlin Wall falls in '89, and that really throws fuel on the fire.
It's strange, isn't it? This event, it was supposed to be about freedom, about unity. But in some parts of Europe, it actually led to conflict and division.
It shows how history, it rarely follows a straight line. The collapse of communism, it created this power vacuum, this wave of nationalist fervor. And sadly, in places like Bosnia, it turned violent. People, they were looking for belonging, a clear identity, and for some that meant turning against their neighbors.
It's a stark reminder that peace, it's fragile, and things can spiral out of control so easily. So knowing what we know now, what steps can we take to prevent these tragedies from happening again? What lessons from Bosnia can we apply to today's world?
One of the biggest takeaways, I think, is early intervention. We can't wait for the violence to start before we do something. We need to be proactive, address the root causes of conflict, poverty, inequality, discrimination, political instability, all of that.
Early intervention, though, that can be tricky. It's a fine line between respecting a country's sovereignty and stopping atrocities. What concrete things can the international community do to find that balance?
You're right. It's not always easy, but it can involve things like diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions targeted at those who are inciting the violence, supporting civil society groups that are working for peace and dialogue, even providing humanitarian aid to lessen suffering and reduce those tensions.
Our sources also talk about international law and holding people accountable. That ICTY set a big precedent, but is that enough? What do we have in place right now to stop these conflicts from happening in the first place?
That's the big question. Accountability is crucial, yeah, but it's mainly reactive. Prevention, That needs a more proactive approach.
Yeah.
It's a multifaceted approach, I guess you could say. It needs strong institutions, inclusive governance, tackling economic disparities, fostering a culture of tolerance, respect for diversity, all of that.
It sounds like a huge task. Kind of overwhelming, honestly. Where do we even start?
I think education is a good place to begin. Understanding the history, the cultural nuances, the human stories behind these conflicts, that's crucial. We got to move beyond the simple explanations and really grapple with the complexities.
That makes sense. Understanding past mistakes, maybe that's how we avoid repeating them. But beyond education, what can everyday people like our listeners do to help create a more peaceful world?
That's a great question. I think it starts with being informed. Having real conversations, challenging our own biases, and supporting organizations that are working for peace and understanding.
Yeah.
Even small acts of kindness, of compassion, those can make a difference.
It's a reminder that peace, it's not just the absence of war, right? It's something we have to actively work for. So this deep dive, it's not just about learning about Bosnia. It's about giving ourselves the knowledge, the tools to build a better future.
Exactly. And speaking of knowledge and tools, we touched on some of those fun facts that came out of our research on the Bosnian War earlier. Want to dig into those a bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. I always love those little details that get missed in the big picture. They offer a unique perspective. What else did we find?
Well, one that I find particularly interesting is the nickname for Bosnia and Herzegovina, the land of 1,000 rivers.
Mm-hmm.
It really is, yeah. A film, even one about war, can remind us we're all human. Seeing those connections, seeing ourselves and others, even across enemy lines, it's powerful. It makes you think.
It does. It reminds you that under all the politics, all the history, all the cultural stuff, we're all just people trying to figure out who we are, where we belong, what our purpose is.
Exactly.
So wrapping up this deep dive into the Bosnian War, what's the big takeaway for our listeners? What's the one lesson that still matters today?
I think it's understanding that peace, it doesn't just happen. It's not passive.
Right.
It takes work, constant work, and vigilance, and a willingness to really engage with all the messy complexities. We have to challenge our own biases, look for different perspectives, build bridges across those divides.
Powerful message. And it feels especially relevant now when the world feels so divided. We've talked about the history, the culture, the laws, early intervention, international law, education. But what now? What can we, just as individuals, do to make the world a more peaceful place?
It might sound cheesy, but I really think change starts with each of us. It starts with being informed, learning about the world, talking to each other, and challenging injustice wherever we see it.
So we can't just sit back and watch. We got to be part of making things better.
Exactly. We all have a part to play in creating a more just, more compassionate world. Maybe that means supporting organizations working for peace, or maybe it's just being kinder to the people around us.
Those little acts of kindness, they can add up, right? They might not be news, but they can change things one interaction at a time.
Absolutely. It's those little moments, the connections, the empathy, the understanding. That's what builds a more peaceful and just society.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. It's been a really thought-provoking journey, and I feel like I have more hope now, and I understand the world a bit better.
The pleasure was all mine. And remember, learning never stops. Keep asking questions. Keep searching for the truth. Keep fighting for a better world.
Wise words. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Bosnian War. We hope you found it informative and engaging. If you want to learn more about what we talked about, check out the resources in the show notes. And be sure to join us next time for another deep dive into a fascinating and timely topic. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, keep searching for the truth.